The next part of this course involves discussion on web application hacking. Now, we've talked about attacking the server itself and some attack techniques as well as some tools. Now we're going to look at web application hacking itself. Now, beyond the server and the web server software such as IIS or Apache, web-based applications are also vulnerable to a wide variety of attacks. And in fact, really attacking the server or the web server software is just an intermediary goal to get to the web application itself. Web application attack vectors include attacks on the website content itself, the web interface, the web application logic, and even related supporting software such as database software like SQL Server, MySQL, and so forth. Now, web attacks can come in all kinds of flavors. They can be client or server-side attacks, and they can use several methods of attack, including scripting attacks, injection attacks, some identity validation attacks, and even others. Now, what are the goals of web application hacking? What are we trying to get out of this? Well, we might be trying to get data access or be able to alter data. For example, we might try to target a web server that is the front end for a database application. We might want to get in there and either get unauthorized access to that data to get it out of the web application or even to alter it. We also might want to deface the website. A lot of hacktivists, for example, basically deface websites to carry a message to the public based upon their particular beliefs. We also might want entry into a network. A lot of web applications, unfortunately, are sitting on unsecure servers, and they connect to an internal network somewhere. They're not separated by a DMZ like we would like for them to be. So sometimes hacking into a web server and the web application itself can get you an entryway into the internal network. A lot of times the hacker will also target a web application in order to carry out an attack on any clients that connect to it, any users that use that particular web application. So those are some of the goals of web application hacking from a hacker's perspective. Now, there are multiple possible vectors that you could use to attack a website or a web application. Things, this is not all inclusive, of course, but things like improper permissions set on directories and files, where anyone could look at those directories or read those files or even execute things in those directories. You also might take advantage of weak or non-existent authentication. Sometimes basic authentication is used where there's a plain text password. Sometimes the authentication is not configured properly. There's also malicious input, and this is typically in the form of input validation issues or parameter issues. You also might see some hackers try to upload malicious scripts to a web application so that they can be later downloaded to a client. This is an example of cross-site scripting, for example. And don't forget malware. There are attacks that involve the use of malware, Trojans, and other things we've discussed already to get that loaded on the application, on the web server, so it can either be downloaded to a client without their knowledge, or so it can disrupt operations on the server itself. Now, there are several tools and techniques that are available to hackers that they could use to attack web applications, and they're probably too numerous to mention all of them here. But a couple of popular ones, in fact, a couple that we'll look at closely, are Acunetics Web Scanner, Metasploit, which we've already discussed a little bit, and some other tools and techniques. And some of these don't even require tools. Some of these require just knowing how to get the right attack in motion. For example, putting SQL injection into an input field is really just knowledge and how to do it. Now, here's some of the different hacks and some of the weaknesses and vulnerabilities, if you will, that could affect web applications. You have cookie access and alteration, and as you know, a cookie is basically a text file that's placed on a client's machine so that it can store information about their visit to a website so that maybe they get a better user experience. Unfortunately, sometimes authentication information can be placed there too, and those cookies are not always secure. They can be forged, they can be accessed, they can be altered. You also might have directory browsing of the website itself. This is called directory traversal. And this might involve looking at directories, some of them not related to the site, some of them possibly related to the operation of the web server, where a hacker could look and find the different files on there, sensitive files possibly, and even interact with those files, such as read them or write to those directories and so forth. You also might have input validation attacks, and this is basically where an attacker would put input into a field, for example, a form field, where you would expect normal types of information to go, a username, for example, or a last name and a first name. And they may put input in there like a series of numbers or characters that the web server or web app can't handle, and that would cause it to do some interesting things. Cross-site scripting, I already mentioned, that might be where you get a malicious script uploaded to the server so it can be downloaded later to a client's machine. You also have parameter attacks where different parameters and input fields might be input into the web application form, and this could also be considered form attacks as well, that the web application doesn't react well to. So there's no input validation, there's no parameter checking, and so forth. There's also things like authentication attacks if the web application is not set up to use solid, strong authentication. If it's using basic password authentication, for example, it might store the passwords improperly or not encrypt them, or store them in a plain text file that's easily readable. You also, as I mentioned, have injection attacks such as SQL and XML injection. There's also cross-site forgery attacks, permissions problems, and a host of others. Error handling, for example, can be important because errors can report back information about the website, but the right error could also cause the website or web application to do weird things like spit up a prompt, for example. You also have the standard application types of issues that you might see, buffer overflows and so forth. You also might see connection vulnerabilities, how the web server is set up to connect to the outside world, whether it's via VPN or another network connection. There might be vulnerabilities there. And finally, if all else fails, sometimes a hacker may just wage a denial of service attack on the website itself so no one can use it. So these are just some examples of things that a hacker could do to a web application.